I'm Austin Wilt. I lead product analytics at Slac. This is a data product management track, and so I'm going to be talking about the 18 months or so I spent ending in January at Slac as a data product manager. I have worked in analytics more or less my entire career. I've always really loved the act of trying to influence the business and the product through the voice of data. About 2 years ago, I was working at Pinterest, leading monetization analytics. You may have seen them in the news today. It's a big day for Pinterest. And I was at one of those familiar times in my career where I felt like I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what was next. I felt a little bit stuck. I felt like I wanted to be able to move into leading a broader data organization, but I had some pretty big gaps in my own experience and skill set to get there. Namely, I had always been in analytics, and I didn't know much about data engineering, which felt like a big and problematic blind spot. Also, as a data scientist and leading analytics teams, that's a support function. I was very familiar with having a very strong opinion based in data, but never ultimately being the decision maker, and that felt like a pretty big handicap thinking about leading a bigger and bigger team. And I had a little person at home, and so work-life balance was really on my mind. And around then, an opportunity came my way to be a data product manager at Slac. And it was as I'm sure you all know, kind of a new role. You didn't know much about it. The role that was presented to me at Slac at the time was pretty ill-defined. It was kind of like, we want to invest more in data. We don't exactly know what that looks like. Product managers at Slac are leaders, and so we think we should hire a product manager into the world of data, and that will help us figure out what to do and how to really develop data at Slac. And for me, it checked all those boxes. I was going to get to work really closely with data engineering. I was going to get to be a product manager and a decision maker and get exposed to product management at Slac, which was really exciting. And I'd be an IC, so a little bit better work-life balance potentially. And so I jumped at the opportunity. I moved over to Slac. And when I got there, I did kind of the rounds talking to people in the business. And what I heard was the very typical thing that you hear a lot in analytics, which is we don't have the data that we need, we don't really trust the data that we have, and when it comes down to it, data is just not making the impact that we need it to make on the business and on the way that we build product. So I said, okay, great, that sounds very familiar to me. I've worked in analytics a long time. Then I said, okay, I'm a data product manager. I work with data engineering. I'm kind of in this backroom, back-end role, and so I kind of put my head down and went to work with data engineering. And it checked all those boxes and all of those things that I wanted it to be. I learned a ton about data engineering, became a lot more technical than I had in the past. I learned a lot about being a product manager and a decision maker, a lot about engineering sprints and a lot about processes. And we were making a ton of progress. We changed the way we worked a ton. We felt more productive. We were making better decisions, building better products, getting better outcomes. But I picked my head up maybe 6 or 9 months later and kind of went back into the business. And I heard the same things that I heard when I got there, which was we don't have enough data, we don't trust the data we have, and it's not having the impact that it's supposed to have, which was pretty disheartening because it felt like we were making so much progress. How is it not having an impact on the outcome? And what I realized was we had gotten caught up in the false sense of local progress when we weren't really focused on the outcome. We weren't solving the actual problem that we needed to solve. And so we really changed the way that we were working. And the big theme was we have to focus on that ultimate outcome. Just like things had always been in analytics, we have to be focused on the value that data is ultimately providing to the business. We can't get caught up in this false sense of, we're more efficient, we have a higher throughput in our engineering teams, and we think we're doing better road mapping processes and all this stuff. We have to focus on that outcome, or we're not going to move the needle and we're not going to make the impact that we need to make. So that's what I'm going to talk about today is kind of how we solved those problems and some of the key principles that we used to really change from, that false feeling of progress to actual progress in the business. And so the 3 biggest things that we did, the first one was increasing curation as we brought in the audience. we had really been solving for really advanced technical folks, giving them great access to our data warehouse and to data tools, but we were ignoring this broader audience at the company. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how do we curate data for a broader audience at Slack. The second was balancing foundational investments with immediate value to the business. And this is the age-old tension between engineering teams that really want to build exciting, interesting, technically foundational things from the ground up, and the distraction that can sometimes come from stakeholder requests and stakeholder needs. And we really spent some thoughtful time on how to balance that foundational work with that kind of more immediate and urgent stakeholder requests. And then the third thing, connecting engineers with the end users. Maybe the most obvious, but also definitely the most important, and something that we had sort of totally missed, where if we want to impact that ultimate outcome, maybe the best way we can do it is just to get the engineers in front of those stakeholders so that they can really internalize that outcome that they're trying to drive firsthand. All right, so the first one, increasing curation as you brought in the audience. Originally at Slack, we had lived entirely in this bottom of the pyramid era, where we had this great data warehouse. We were focused on building super powerful data tools. There was no access controls, no real curation. It was really aimed at these advanced data users, and that's really data scientists. They had access to all data, anything that you want. They could do anything with it. And they had really advanced, really powerful tools. They were really happy. The data scientists at Slack felt like our data warehouse is great, our data tools are great, everything's great. The problem was that if you stepped outside of that audience, nobody had the skill set and nobody had the tools that they needed to get at any of the data. So those data scientists were a huge blocking point. They had to do every curation every time anyone needed anything. It had to go through one of those humans, which was a big problem and a huge thing that was leading to that message of, we don't have data in the business. We just don't have data. And so what we did was we said, we need to start by defining categories of audiences beyond just those data scientists and acknowledge that we need to solve for them. And so we chose 2 additional audiences. The next level above data scientists, we call business analysts or subject matter experts. And that's people who data isn't their full-time job, but data is a part of their job. And they're going to want to get hands-on. They're going to want to really understand data. They're going to want to get into the nitty-gritty and into the details, but in more of a part-time way where they need to be informed, they need to understand, they have deep knowledge in an area, but they may or may not even know SQL. And so they need a little bit more hand-holding in order to get there. And they don't need access to all of the data at Slack. They, in fact, need a slightly more curated experience because they're not going to be spending the time and energy to really understand how to navigate, whether they should be using dim all users v3 or dim all users v3 latest. They're not going to keep up. And so what we defined that we wanted to do for them was say, they're going to get access to curated data sandboxes, not the whole data warehouse, but we're going to curate for them sandboxes of data that are relevant to their business area. Instead of having access to all functionality, we're going to give them reporting and exploration functionality, which means they don't just get a report of metrics, but they get some kind of area where they can play with the data, do some deep exploration on their own, but with some good guardrails in place. And then we're going to make sure that they get a user-friendly tool set with some education. And so it doesn't need to be, a foolproof tool where they can just on the first day come in and use it, but we're going to provide them a tool that's a little bit more advanced than that, where with some education they can learn how to use it, but not nearly the level that those advanced data users are getting. And then we defined a third audience, which is everybody at the company, all employees and leadership. And we said, okay, for that audience, they want access to the narrowest set of data, the most limited set. It needs to be the most highly curated, the most self-explanatory, the easiest to use. Primarily what they're going to get is just reports, and maybe they can adjust time windows and things like that, but primarily the functionality that they're going to get is just reporting, and their tool set needs to be super user-friendly. No education really necessary, just a pretty dashboard sort of thing. So now we've got these 3 audiences and we've said, okay, we've only really solved for 1. We need to solve for these additional 2. How are we going to do it? The biggest gap here was we had no plan to do any curation because at the bottom of the pyramid you don't. And so how are we going to get there? How are we going to curate our data? And so we kind of defined 3 very high level, very simple steps. We need to have somebody whose job it is to define what data people are going to need to use, somebody whose job it is to curate that data, and then somebody whose job it is to create that kind of visualization and accessible area. Define is about working with the business to say exactly what's in this data set, exactly what does it mean, detailed definitions, things that can be translated to the person who's going to curate it. And then when this whole thing circles back, that's also going to work on education and adoption to help people understand what's in their data. The curation step is about operationalizing. And that's where we say, okay, who's going to build a scalable data pipeline that's got alerting and monitoring and is SLA'd and is going to arrive at 8 or 9 a.m. every day reliably and doesn't break. That's also the place where we say instead of building one-off data sets every time, that we're doing some kind of standard data modeling and developing some best practices on the back end. And then the visualization step. And that could be as simple as just loading something into a dashboard, or it could be more complex if you want to create a sandbox where you need to do some data modeling specific to your visualization tool. You're going to build that reporting and exploration functionality, and then you're going to bring that to people, you're going to educate them how to use it, and you're going to get it in front of them so that they adopt it. So then now that we've defined those audiences and these steps, the last remaining piece is, okay, who is going to do each of these things? And this was really important for us because previously we had a data science team who was doing everything, who was responsible for end-to-end all data things in the business. And it was really a problem because it meant that they weren't spending much time on interpretation and analysis because they were also responsible for data pipelines and data visualizations and all of these things that they were both not great at, didn't love, and was taking up a lot of their time and energy. And so we added data engineering to the mix, and we'll talk about that later, that we actually started throwing them into the business and embedding them as kind of the curators of these data sets. Turns out engineers are much better, no surprise, at building sustainable, repeatable data pipelines than analysts are. And we also built out an IT business intelligence team, and we said that they're responsible at those top 2 levels of the pyramid for beautiful data visualizations that people in the business can adopt and use. Turns out our data scientists weren't super enthused about spending a bunch of time on making things pretty and accessible to execs. No surprise there again. And so they weren't doing a great job of it anyway. There's an entire function called business intelligence where people are really good at that. And so we created that team and made it happen. We also separated out between product and business. Product data is a very different ballgame than kind of corporate business data. So we separated the world and said, on the product side, we're going to use our data engineering. And on the business side, we're going to also utilize an IT data engineering team that's thinking more about data integrations than about logging and product and behavioral data. And so now we've got kind of this audiences that we've defined. We've defined the steps that need to happen to bring the data to them. And we've set up this new structure and these new people and figured out who's going to do what job to make this all happen. And so where has it gotten us? First of all, it took us a while to set this all up because we literally created entire new teams based on this new plan, which was a non-trivial exercise. We were also starting from a world of like muddy chaos in terms of data. You could find the same data in 4 places and it would mean different things. And so it took probably a year to get from this is the previous 3 slides, this is our plan, to we actually have these people in place in the business doing this work. But the results have been great. They've been really, really good. A few kind of key themes of things that we've seen. One is we have trustworthy and consistent data that comes from high quality data pipelines. So that message of we don't trust the data, when it comes to this data we're curating, has gone away. The data is trustworthy, it's really high quality, which is fantastic. Self-serve data access, that message that we're hearing of people don't have access to the data that they need. In the cases where we've done the curation and done the work, that message has also gone away because people have this self-serve data access now in the places that we've put in the work to do it. And more time for data scientists to do actual analysis, which is making them happier because they have more time to do what really provides value to the business and is making our stakeholders much happier. All right. So that's one piece of the puzzle. Next piece. Balancing foundational investments with immediate value to the business. This is, again, that kind of age-old struggle of, do I do the strategic stuff that's going to make a big impact later down the road, or do I do the urgent stuff that someone's banging on my door for today? And so on the left, where it says previous focus, that's the way that we used to do planning and data engineering. We used to all sit in a room at the beginning of a quarter, and we'd say, what does great look like a year, 2 years, 3 years from now? And we would kind of paint a picture of what our data warehouse need to look like and what data at Slack should be. And then we'd say, what's the next quarter of work that we need to do to get us a step closer to that? And we'd build a beautiful roadmap and a beautiful quarterly plan. And then, of course, lo and behold, the quarter would start and the stakeholders would start banging down our door and saying, I need this now, I need this now, I need this now. And we'd do all that stuff. And then we'd get to the end of the quarter, and we would do barely any of the stuff we planned for, and a whole lot of randomizing or things falling down or immediate stakeholder requests, which was really frustrating. And we'd have these talks every quarter about how we're going to do better of doing the stuff that we planned for and less of the stakeholder requests. We threw all of that out and said, okay, we're clearly just doing it wrong. And we said what we need to do is take a much more balanced approach out of the gate in terms of how we're doing planning. We said, okay, we're going to upfront allocate time to both of these things, both the immediate stakeholder needs and that long-term strategic investment stuff. And then we're going to make a plan to kind of wall off our resources in order to actually make that happen in both directions. The way that we approach it in the planning process is, first of all, we actually defined 3 buckets, because what we figured out was that there's a bucket called business critical initiatives that is the stuff that you have no choice. So before you even sit down to talk about strategic work versus immediate stakeholder work, you have to cover your business critical initiatives. And what that means for us at Slack, we do OKRs. So any high-level company OKRs that have a data engineering component, we have to support them. We have no choice. And then there's always like this public commitment stuff. So for example, if we at our annual conference announce that we're going to be HIPAA compliant 7 months from now, any data engineering work that has to happen for us to get there, we have to do it. We have no choice. And so step 1 in the planning process became business critical initiatives, make sure we find them and identify them and plan for them, and just kind of say that time is carved out and it has to happen. We usually go through a process of what's the minimum viable amount of work can we do in order to satisfy those things, because they're not strategic. We just have to make them happen, and let's set aside that time. And then once we're done with that, we look at strategic projects and immediate stakeholder value projects. In the strategic bucket, we've really scoped down the projects that we're going to do in that bucket. And so it has to be only the few most high priority things, because we really want to solve for actually making progress and achieving things. And that's all of the foundational stuff. That's all of the infrastructure overhauls. That's tech debt. That's new explorations. All of those things. That's always the most fun brainstorming session with the engineers. And then in the immediate stakeholder value section, what we've really found there is that if we plan for it up front, we do a much better job of it. Because instead of it feeling really, really reactive and like we're just doing things that people shout at us all throughout the quarter, if we take the time and energy to go into the business, figure out what those asks are and plan for them, first of all, we can say a lot more no, because we have our act together up front. We're saying, here's all your requests, here's the ones that are above the fold, and here's the ones we're saying no to, which people are a lot more receptive to in a more planned way. And we can approach them in a much more strategic manner. So we can look across the business and think about all the stakeholder requests that are happening and how are we going to achieve them in a way that feels more thoughtful and maybe also sneaks us into this green bucket of strategic projects, because now that we're planning for them, we can add 10 or 20% of time and scope and do them in a more thoughtful, more strategic, more repeatable way. This also allows us to plan our resources better. Most people are going to do projects across all of those things, projects across all of that space, all of those buckets. But we started saying, also, we should take our top couple strategic projects, the things that we said were the most important to us, we should map people to them and we should hide them. And we shouldn't let them work on anything else, so that if a business critical project ends up bigger than we thought it was, or a stakeholder comes banging down the door with something really important, that these people are not up for grabs because they're hiding somewhere and no one's ever talking to them, and so they're really going to make progress on those strategic projects. And then we did the same thing for people who are responsible to stakeholders. And that has been a really interesting experience because it's taken the message from this stakeholder work is distracting and we want to minimize it to your job is that stakeholder work. It's really, really valuable to the business and you're responsible to do it in the most thoughtful way possible. You're responsible to those stakeholders and we're going to reinforce how important that work is. And that is entirely your job. And so it's really shifted the mentality for the people in that bucket from this is the distracting, crappy work that I'm just trying to get through to this is a really interesting and valuable part of my job that I'm going to focus on and try to win at. Okay. So where has this landed us? First of all, we're much better at reliably delivering on those critical business initiatives because we're mapping out time for them, which is great. It has helped a lot in terms of data engineering's reputation at Slack. We are a much more reliable team. Making meaningful progress against select strategic work. We've really focused our efforts on what are the top few things every quarter and making sure that we're making meaningful progress against them, which has been happening. And then the last one is that better prioritize stakeholder projects with more thoughtful engineering solutions, which has also just totally changed the dynamic in the game in terms of how data engineering is viewed and how we're operating in terms of our relationship with those stakeholders and what we're able to achieve for them over time. And I will say lastly, we used to feel a lot on a hamster wheel. We weren't really getting anywhere quarter to quarter. Things weren't getting better over time. And taking this more kind of intentional, thoughtful approach has created a world where you can really feel the progress every quarter. And things are better, they're more efficient, they're more effective. We're set up better as we move forward, which feels really good to people on the team. Okay. The last one, which is maybe the simplest and maybe the most obvious, but we completely missed it in the beginning, was connect engineers with their end users. We've really seen that more contact, more context, and more connection with those end users has by far yielded a better result. We have 4 sub-teams in our data engineering org. We have a data model and architecture team, which is basically like our data pipelines traditional data engineering team. We have a data tools team that builds end user tools. We have a data platform team, which is responsible for tools to access the data warehouse, and we have a data infrastructure team. And we used to just think of them as 4 teams. And we've remapped the world kind of like this, which really shows you who's responsible to who should be close to stakeholders and who shouldn't. And so we identified that this data model and architecture team and the data tools team, they need a lot of contact with stakeholders. They are directly responsible to people in the business because they're either building tools that people in the business use or they're building data sets that people in the business use. So we need to make sure that they're close to the stakeholders. This data platform team kind of answers to those 2 teams, and they should be pulling a lot of roadmap items from what those 2 teams need. And then data infrastructure is very naturally a much more back-end team. And just drawing the world like this has allowed us to identify that, hey, yes, data infrastructure engineers, you can tell stakeholders to go away, they should not be bothering you. But data tools team, we need to find tons of opportunities for you to interact with stakeholders and spend time in the business. And we've really focused on that on the data tools side, is tons of interaction with stakeholders and in the business. And on the data modeling and architecture side, what we've done is we've split the team into kind of 2 subgroups. We've said we're going to have a centralized foundational team whose job it is to build horizontal data sets across the business, do foundations, tools, best practices. And then we're going to take half that team and we're going to actually embed them directly in the business to get them really, really close to their stakeholders. And what that looks like for us, and we've actually done the same thing with business intelligence, which if you remember is that visualization function, is we've created these data pods in the business. We used to just have data scientists from the product analytics team in the business, but we've thrown data engineers in there alongside them. And we've said, you're not supporting the analytics team, you're embedded, you're partnering with them, and you're embedded alongside them. Same thing for IT business intelligence. So now in our product teams, we have all of these 3 functions working together. So now the data engineer isn't sitting somewhere on a different floor, just taking requirements and directions from an analyst. They're in the business, they're building their own roadmap, and they're really able to assess and decide what are the most important things to do and really maintain that connection with value. They know what the business needs are. They know ultimately what the stakeholder is trying to do. And so instead of taking filtered requirements, they're best able to say, this is the data that we need to curate. This is what we need to build in order to have the biggest impact on the business. And again, what we've seen has been really positive. I will say that, the old, should I be embedded? Should I be centralized? Doesn't come without cost. There's been some bumps along the roads in the data engineering world. Embedding data engineers into product teams has not been a totally seamless thing. And we continue to iterate on how that goes to make them feel excited about it, get them to have as much impact as possible. But overall, it's been really, really positive. In the data tools world, that data tools team in data engineering, their increased exposure to the stakeholders has resulted in just a lot more high-value work being done on their side, both in the tools that they're building and in our experiments framework, which they're responsible for. On the data engineering embedded in the pillars side, we've made some really, really measurable progress. For example, we now have metrics in every product area with interactive data visualizations that people can use, which is huge. There's data sets in every product area that people can really trust, can really rely on, have been curated by those data engineers and visualized by our IT team. And we've ended up with a really nice set of repeatable and scalable data pipelines that we didn't have before at Slac. Some of it exists in a foundational centralized way, and some of them exist in individual product areas. And again, I feel like this, connect engineers with stakeholders is the most kind of trivial and obvious thing, but it feels like actually the biggest missing piece in that world of, we're trying to ultimately drive an outcome for our stakeholders, and yet we weren't at all connected to them. And this is, of all three things, definitely the one that's just made the easiest and biggest impact on our ability to go from that false sense of progress that we had before that wasn't having the impact that we wanted to really, really making an impact on the business. That's it. Thanks.
Just a pretty quick one. When you wall off people, do those teams rotate? I'm walled off for this week or this quarter, or do you just, they're always walled off? Do you rotate the people for their jobs?
A little bit. So on the embedded side, those people really are embedded. Permanent is a strong word, but they have moved their chair to sit with a product team just like the data scientists do. And so they really are dedicated to that work. We have debates all the time about how long they're dedicated for. The current agreement is at least a quarter at a time. So it's a pretty significant period of time that they're walled off because there's so much business context for them to get. And so I think actually the longer that they're embedded, as long as they're happy with it, the better that goes. On the back end side in those strategic projects, that's much more rotating. A month at a time, maximum a quarter at a time if it's a huge project, where we just say instead of splitting your time between different things, for this entire month or this entire quarter, you're going to focus on this. And so it's much more of a rotating thing, which also from an engineering perspective, that's kind of one of the most coveted things to get to do is just kind of put your head down and build something really cool. And so I think the rotation there is a lot more helpful.
Hi. I had a question about the slide you had about the data pods embedded in the product teams. I'm guessing that different engineers in different pods share the same infrastructure. But how do you prevent knowledge silos and things like that? If one data engineer is working on this product, another data engineer is working on this product, but they share kind of the same underlying data, how do you prevent knowledge silos between those?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's the age-old problem, right? Of either you're going to embed, and so you're going to get the business value, or you're going to centralize, and you're going to get, really good standardized things. I think having that centralized data engineering team that they're a part of, and then their embedded resource in a pillar helps, because they're still one team. They still belong to the data engineering team. They report to the head of data modeling and architecture, so they still spend a lot of time together. And that team is so early stage. I think it now has 9 people on it, and I think it had 1 person on it last summer. So it's still pretty new. And so they spend a lot of time together. Embedded for them right now means 70 or 80% embedded, and 20 or 30% spending time with their team on their processes and building things on their side. And so they're putting, I think, even an inordinate amount of time and energy into that. How do we do things in a standard way? Who knows how that evolves over time, but for now, they're really focused on that. How do we build things in a standardized manner?
Hi, I'm just wondering, how big is the data engineering team kind of at Slac? Where were you when this all started, and how did you grow? And for a team that's really small, say 2 engineers,
Yeah.
how would we go about kind of taking this kind of talk and trying to implement it with something so small?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when I got to Slack, I think 2 years ago, data engineering was maybe 6 or 7 people. And my first day, they were doing quarterly planning, actually, and it was happening on a Post-it note on someone's computer. And I think now there are around 30 in total, I want to say, data engineers. So it's grown really substantially, and it's gone from just kind of one pool of people into these much more differentiated functions. Obviously, you don't get to do that if you have 2 people. You have to be a lot more, kind of selective and a lot more kind of all-around players. And so obviously, you can't probably afford to fully embed people in the business, and some of these concepts, you can't hide somebody in a back room, someone will find them, right? These are luxuries of scale that you don't have with 2 people. But I think some of the concepts still apply. I would argue that the first 2 pieces about curating data for audiences and figuring out how to find a balance are still really, really important. And that the sort of, getting too embedded and that kind of stuff is stuff that you have to get to later when you have more scale.
Hi, I'm very curious about the IT business intelligence job title. I used to hire into analyst roles, and I could never tell what business intelligence was. And so I'm interested to see how is that redeveloping there, and what tasks are associated with that, and how do you split that up between the data scientist, data engineer, and the IT person?
Yeah, good question. That's been really interesting at Slack. So one of the interesting things about Slack is that it started as a very B2C consumer company, and then it's kind of developed into also an enterprise sales company. And so we have this really interesting mix of people who work at Slack, a lot of which come from like B2C tech. And then we have a lot of people that come from the enterprise world. And in the B2C tech world, you end up with data science and product analytics teams and data engineering teams. And in the B2B world, in enterprise, a lot of times you don't have those teams. You just have an IT team doing all of your data stuff. At Slack, we have both, which is really, really interesting and has really been valuable to me to see kind of the value and the skill set on the other side. Concretely, what it's meant for us is we bought Looker. We didn't have a data visualization tool that anyone without a great skill set couldn't utilize. Our data tools team has built a great homegrown tool, but it's incredibly powerful and incredibly inaccessible. And so we bought Looker. Our ITBI team did that. They were just formed about 9 months ago, that ITBI team. And right now we have 2 folks who are fully embedded in product that will continue to grow this year because it's a fairly new thing. And literally what they do is they work with the business. They take the data that gets curated by the product data engineering team, and then they build a data model in Looker through LookML so that it can get visualized and explored in Looker. And then they work with people in the business. Okay, what data do you need? Okay, I'm going to work with the data engineering team to make sure I have it. It's in my data model in an explorable way. They build dashboards, and then they build those sandboxes where people can kind of drag and drop dimensions, build their own tables, do their own exploration, and then they work on that education and adoption. So those top couple layers of the pyramid where people need that curation, even though data engineering is curating, that ITBI person is really in the business helping with the requirements, building their own LookML data model, which is very different from the data model that we have in the data warehouse, and then working with people in the business on kind of how to use it, how to answer their questions using it, and that sort of thing. And honestly, it was something that we were doing such a bad job of that with our data scientists and data engineers, and the ITBI people are just such pros at it. They're fantastic at it. So having them come in and just entirely focus on that has really up-leveled our ability to get data to people in the business.
So kind of building on one of the previous questions, and also you mentioned that it took about 12 months to actually implement this within the organization. I'm sure there were a bunch of challenges, not just on the technical side, but also creating this new function and defining this. What do you think were some of the key inflection points in progress over those 12 months? And particularly interested in whether those inflection points were kind of coming from bottoms up support, or whether there was some kind of key top down, executive support that came along the way.
Yeah, I think it's been a healthy combination of both, in the sense that a lot of what we needed was an org design that we could hire out into that makes sense. So that first section about, we're going to define these different stages and these new audiences. We're going to build out the data engineering team from 6 or 7 to 30. We're going to hire this ITBI team. that's all top-down stuff, right? Presenting them an org structure and this audience stuff that they can get behind and that they can be willing to invest in. And they wanted to, but part of what they were looking to us for was how do we make this additional investment in the data world? And so there was a lot of top-down work in terms of drawing out what this meant and then getting headcount and hiring out teams. That was a huge part of, I think, why this took so long. But also, the bottoms-up part was really important. And the way that we've really tackled that was we had 7 product pillars at Slack, and implementing this stuff across 7 different places was just going to be too cumbersome and never going to happen on day one. And so we would kind of pick one place and we would say, okay, in a bottoms-up way, this pillar is product area is super excited about data and they need this specific thing. So let's throw at them like 2 data scientists, a data engineer, and an ITBI person all at once in a world where all the other pillars maybe have like 10% of that support. Let's just concentrate it all in one place and let's kind of get a chance to, from the bottom up, figure out what this model actually looks like in practice and iterate on it before we start to spread it. And we're still in those 7 product pillars. We're like 3.5. So we're about halfway through in terms of fully building out this model because we kind of started from 1 and then we say, okay, this is working and this is how we want to iterate, copy it to somewhere else and kind of edit it for that area of the business. And so I think that like resourcing came and that buy-in top down, and then the bottoms up is where you really start to see it in action and iterate on it.